Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Joining me today, economist Thomas Sowell of the Hoover Institution, the author of such classics as Basic Economics and The Vision of the Anointed. By the way, The Vision of the Anointed explains everything. It is a truly great book. When I call that one a classic, I really do mean it. Author of such classics as The Vision of the Anointed, Dr. Sowell has most recently published Economic Facts and Fallacies, several topics from which we will now be discussing. Men and Women, from Economic Facts and Fallacies. I'm quoting you to yourself, Tom. Quote, "It is widely believed that the rise of American women in high-level occupations since the 1960s has been due to anti-discrimination laws, and that these in turn have been due to the feminist movement. In reality, the proportion of women in high-level occupations was greater during the first decades of the 20th century than in the middle of the 20th century, and all of this was before the feminist movement." Explain.
Yes, in the first half of the 20th century, for example, in 1908, the percentage of women in who's who in America was twice what it was in 1950. And various fields, if you look at the women who got PhDs in economics, chemistry, who got law degrees, other postgraduate degrees, those were all higher in the 20s and 30s than they were in the 50s. And there was a very simple reason for it. Women in those days got married later.
In the early years
in
of
the
the century.
early years.
Right.
Over time, the age of marriage and the age of beginning to have children began to decline. And the classic era was, of course, the era of the baby boom. And that's when women hit a low in their proportion of the postgraduate degrees and in the professions in which those degrees would be used. Now, around 1956, the age of marriage began rising. And in 1957, the age of having children rose, strangely enough. And as that rise continued, you saw women rising again in these various professions. So that now one of the professions they reached in 1972, the same proportion they had had back in 1932. And as the age of marriage kept rising and as the number of children kept falling, women went on to higher and higher levels. Now the people on the other side say the opposite by the simple expedient of looking as if the world began in 1960. They ignore all the rest of that, and they say it's all due to the feminist movement, to anti-discrimination laws, and so forth.
Well, you're right. I'm going to quote you again. "Among the many factors which influence male-female economic differences, the most elusive is employer discrimination."
Yes, that when you correct for all the various factors, such as the number of hours worked, the continuous employment versus taking a few years out to have children and so on. You take all that into account, the differences between men and women become quite trivial. If you look at the academic world, or as far back as 1969, women who were never married and who had earned higher incomes than men who had never married. They became a tenured professor at a higher rate than men who had never married. And then later on, if you look at the general population, if you take the women who are past the childbearing years and who work continuously, their incomes were higher than men who would work continuously, and so on. So the difference is that not that the employer is paying them differently, but that they have different characteristics.
So the central variable in explaining economic differences between men and women is not employer discrimination, not the rise of feminism. It's that women, it's child rearing, marriage and child rearing. That's the variable. As that varies, a women's arrival or participation rate in high-level occupations varies with that. That's
Absolutely.
the correlation. Okay. Now, in principle, you note, family responsibilities could be perfectly evenly divided between fathers and mothers. But that isn't the way it has worked in practice. Quote, I'm quoting you again, "Since economic consequences follow from practices rather than principles, the asymmetrical division of domestic responsibilities produces male-female differences in income," close quote. Question, what are the policy implications of that? If we become fixed on eliminating male-female income differences, is it the case that the only choice, the only route for doing that is to involve the government in redesigning the very nature of the family?
Well,
or am I leaping to a melodramatic conclusion?
No. Yeah, and logically that's certainly true. However, not all domestic responsibilities can be shared equally, such as having babies, which is not an inconsequential thing since the existence of the human race depends on it. But what it means is that women make choices that make a lot of sense for them. For example, the choice of occupations, that women tend not to go into occupations in which there's a very high rate of obsolescence. I mean, and if you're a computer engineer and you take 5 years out to have a child and have the child up to the age where you can put him in daycare, well, my gosh, the world has changed.
Your job is gone.
You'd have to start way back. On the other hand, if you become a librarian, you become a teacher, other occupations like that, then you can take your 5 years off, come back, and pick up pretty much where you left off.
Right. Income facts and fallacies. You deal with a number of topics in Economic Facts and Fallacies about fallacies concerning income inequality, and so forth. Let's take three: income stagnation, executive pay, and social mobility. Income stagnation. You quote disapprovingly this assertion in the Washington Post: the incomes of most American households have remained stubbornly flat over the past 3 decades. Now, I say you quote that, and then you go on to demolish that. Would you demolish it for us, please?
That statement, as it's made, has some semblance of validity. But the problem is you're talking about households rather than about flesh and blood human beings. One of the real fallacies that runs through a lot of talk about income is confusing statistical categories with actual flesh and blood people. Households are of different sizes. They vary over time. They vary from one group to another. They vary from one income level to another. So, for example, there are 39 million people in the bottom 20% of households and 64 million in the top 20%. So you're saying, yes, 24 million additional people do tend to have more money. The household thing is really a tip-off, I think. Whenever I see somebody quoting household income, he's trying to make things look bad.
It's as simple as that. All right.
Yes.
All right. There's a rule of life.
Yes. For example, over a period of about 30 years, the household income rose by only 6%. Over those same years, per capita income rose by 51%. Because the number of people per household was declining all the while.
I see.
And when you're comparing income brackets, the number of working people in the top 20% is some multiple of the number of working people in the bottom 20%.
I see. So this notion that society is a layer cake divided into quintiles it's even quintiles is just wrong.
You can do it by category, but that's not doing it by people.
Right. Okay. Executive pay. One of the most popular, I'm quoting you, one of the most popular and fallacious explanations of the very high salaries of corporate executives is greed. Now, why is that a fallacious explanation?
Because you could become the greediest person in the world, and it would not raise your income by one dime.
I've tried it, actually, and it hasn't raised my income. So the question, what's the correct analytical point of departure for examining executive pay then?
The question is not why they accept this money, but why other people are offering it to them.
Right, all right.
And that's a matter of competition. Now, some people argue, see, that you have these various boards on the corporation who are very generous in handing out the stockholders' money to the executives, and that's why they get these high salaries.
Right.
Now, if you wanted to actually test that against anything, you would say, all right, there are some corporations which are not owned by thousands of stockholders, owned by 2 or 3 huge financial companies.
Which have highly paid analysts to monitor exactly what's going on.
Yes.
All right.
That's where the corporate CEOs get the highest pay of all. These people are, they have billions of dollars of their own money at stake, and they're not going to be penny wise and pound foolish to try to get someone for the lowest price. If the guy is the guy who's going to protect their billions, they'll throw him $100 million and consider it's nothing. Okay.
Social mobility. Again, this is a passage you quote disapprovingly. It comes from the New York Times, so it does. They know how to write in an oracular fashion. It does sound
as if they just come from interviewing God, and
yes,
this is what he told them.
It does sort of simply sound true. Quote: merit has replaced. This is talking about social mobility, class distinctions, and so forth. Merit has replaced the old system of inherited privilege. We begin with good news. However, it's the New York Times, so we will end with bad news. But merit, it turns out, is at least partly class-based. Parents with money, education, and connections cultivate in their children the habits that the meritocracy rewards. So even though we've replaced inherited privilege with meritocracy, now we discover that merit is inherited. Now, it does sound plausible. What's wrong with that as a matter of analysis?
I can think of a number of heiresses and bimbos who would be an argument to the contrary, but I won't go that route. First of all, people aren't paid for merit. They're paid for productivity. You know, someone who had all kinds of handicaps to overcome, you know, might have a tremendous amount of merit just to end up as a trained carpenter.
Right.
And somebody who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, sent to the finest schools that money could buy, may have no greater merit in becoming a brain surgeon. But that's not the point. The question is whether the brain surgeon's productivity is greater than that of the carpenter. So merit is really not part of it. But the other thing is that the question is, what are you trying to end up with? Are you trying to end up with the best qualified people doing the job or not? I mean, if I have to have brain surgery, and I'm told that the guy who's going to perform the brain surgery is the world's greatest brain surgeon, but he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and had every privilege. Am I to say, no, give me somebody, you know, who had to fight his way up and who had just barely made the cutoff?
Well, suppose I don't know what the New York Times writer had in mind, but suppose I argue, let's follow the duty of charity and assume that what the New York Times reporter has in mind is a just society. Maybe let's suppose that what they want is a just society. And that is simply not useful in analyzing social mobility?
No.
It's not?
No. It depends on what notion of justice you have. If you mean by justice treating everybody alike, we can go there. If you mean a society in which everyone has equal probabilities, not equal opportunities, equal probability of succeeding, I find that virtually inconceivable. There are so many thousands of factors at work that I find it hard to even imagine how all those factors could work out the same for everybody.
And now what about equal opportunity?
Equal opportunity, yes. But you see, you can have a society of equal opportunity. One kid's family sits around at dinner time and talks about sports, and the other kid's family sits around at dinner time and talks about science. And they do that for 20 years. And now they have an equal opportunity to get into Harvard. Who do you think is most likely to make it?
Gotcha. Okay, we turn from income facts and fallacies to facts and fallacies. Let me say that again because I need to get it. Facts and fallacies concerning the academy. You deal with students and economic finances, but I'd like to deal first with faculties. First, this kind of overall statement that you make. Again, I'm quoting Economic Facts and Fallacies. Many people think of nonprofit organizations such as colleges and universities as free of selfish motives and therefore dedicated to the well-being of others, including society at large. This reminds me of the opening scene in the movie Animal House, where the camera pans across the campus and finds the statue of the founder of the campus and goes down to the base where the words are inscribed, knowledge is good, good for all of us. That assumption is seldom subjected to empirical tests, nor does it survive such tests very well when it is. Close quote. Explain.
Well, one of the things that happens when you have faculty tenure is that the faculty can run the university for its own best interest, regardless of what that does to students. For one simple thing, the faculty tend to arrange the classes so they will fit into convenient times for them. I mean, I don't exempt myself. When I was teaching and the department secretary would say, when do you want to have your classes? I would say, after the morning rush hour and before the evening rush hour. Apparently, I wasn't alone. And so you have all these classes crammed in between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And many students are unable to get the classes they need and the sequence they need in order to graduate on time. But the faculty, as convenience, trumps all that. There was one the provost at Stanford was saying, last year, that we have all kinds of empty classrooms most of the time, and then that means you have to build more buildings in order to
at tens of millions of dollars per building.
That's right.
To build the capacity just for between 10 and 2.
That's right. That's right.
Right. Now, not however that you are disdainful of the principle of faculty self-governance, which you write is central to the operation of an academic institution. But in areas outside their expertise, including areas in which there is no such thing as expertise, Professors can simply indulge their personal prejudices at no cost to themselves. What do you mean by expertise and areas in which there's no such thing as expertise?
Well, for example, in chemistry, there's obviously expertise. There's no way that even on a small college, there's any dean or president can know who ought to be teaching chemistry and what courses, chemistry, physics, math, economics, et cetera, et cetera. So the only sensible—
That's left to the chemistry department.
Yeah, and the physics and the math and economics and so on. But due to so-called faculty self-governance, they also have decision-making power over things in which it's just a matter of personal choice, such as ROTC. I don't know why some professor of French literature should be an authority on whether or not there should be ROTC on campus.
All right. You write about grade inflation and faculties. What's the connection?
Oh, it's much easier on the professor if he has soft grades. My goodness, no one to complain, no one to take up his time, no one to create an unpleasantness, and you know, it makes the administration happy, it makes the students happy, and if the professor doesn't care, it makes him happy.
So you give every student an A, and nobody even bothers to ask for office hours for
That's
you.
right.
Gotcha.
That's right.
All right. Now here's kind of the question. Your argument here as regards faculty is that endowments, tenure, the continued giving from loyal and largely unquestioning alumni, all of these insulate them from what we might otherwise consider market forces, the market being the marketplace for education, and the customers would be the tuition-paying students, right? Okay. And yet, as you yourself say, you yourself make a large point of this, American universities are routinely ranked the best in the world. How can this be?
Oh, they're the best in the world at what they do. And what they do is research.
Okay.
When I was
Actually, go ahead.
When I was a tenured faculty member at UCLA, I used to love these discussions when someone was up with the up or out decision to make. Should he be promoted to tenure or should he be let go and so on? And you'd go around the room and I'd say, oh, the man is a terrible teacher. He doesn't do this, he doesn't do that. They'd go on, I'd listen to all this. And in the end, they'd vote him tenured. And then conversely, we had a guy who was really an outstanding teacher. When the vote finally came, and I must tell you that I was one of those who voted to let him go, because although I was convinced that the students would lose by his going, that was not the decision in my province. My province was to apply the rules set down by the university, and by those rules, which are heavily weighted toward research, he couldn't be kept there. And so he's off somewhere else, being an excellent teacher to somebody else, while the UCLA students have to take pot luck.
And so this is a point that you make, that the large research universities tend to be, in a certain sense, overweighted in reputation when kids are going around looking for undergraduate educations. That is to say, maybe you ought to look at a small liberal arts school. It may not be as famous, it may not have a world ranking, but that's because they're not doing research in particle physics. They may actually have the best physics department for teaching 19 and 20, right?
Absolutely. In fact, the data show that if you look at the colleges whose students go on to receive the PhDs the most, you find all kinds of schools you never heard of outdoing Harvard and Yale. Grinnell, for example,
Grinnell, right.
higher percentage of the people there. Harvey Mudd College for years has some multiple of its, a majority of its students going to get PhDs. That's not true at any of the Ivy League schools.
Okay. Facts and fallacies concerning the academy. We've talked about faculty. I'd like to turn to students and academic finances. Students. One of the biggest fallacies, I'm quoting you again, is that attendance at big-name colleges and universities is virtually essential for reaching the top later in life. Kill yourself to get into Harvard because that's the golden road to the top at Goldman Sachs or General Electric. But it's not true?
Well, no. An actual study was done of the CEOs of the top 50 corporations in America. Only 4 of them had Ivy League degrees. 2 of them had no degrees at all. Some went to community.
So an Ivy League degree is only twice as good as no degree.
That's one way of looking at it.
All right, academic finances. This is, by the way, this is quite subversive, this one that I'm about to read here. Academic institutions often make the argument, I'm quoting you again, that their costs for educating a student are greater than the price they charge as tuition, which some take as a sign of the altruism of a nonprofit institution. But Since teaching is one of the joint products of an academic institution along with research and other activities, the meaning of such a statement is elusive. Close quote.
Yes.
This is one of the routine statements of higher education in America. No matter what we charge you for tuition, it's only a small portion of the total cost of giving you an education.
Yes.
You're saying it's untrue, or you're saying it's simply an incoherent statement?
It's an incoherent statement. It's like saying, what is the average cost of bacon? There is no average cost of bacon. Bacon is produced jointly with ham, pork chops, and pigskin. There's the cost of the pig, and any further division is meaningless. I mean, when I worked for AT&T, they had a huge book which broke down the cost of a telephone. And they showed it to me the first day, and I said, since there's no such thing as the average cost of a joint product, I will never have occasion to open that book. And the whole time I was there, it sat there and gathered dust.
You have won Mr. Congeniality Awards throughout your life, haven't you, Tom? Now, query, how is it the case that across the academic scene, landscape in this country, tuitions have tended to rise at faster than any measure of the cost of living? They've risen faster than inflation. Why is that the case?
Partly it's because the government subsidizes. I remember years ago talking to the president of a small college who said to me that if we were to keep tuition affordable, we would lose millions of dollars in government money every year, because the government has a formula, and if the tuition is within your range, then you don't get the government help. But if it's above the range, you do. Well, heavens, you know, the presidents of colleges can do arithmetic, and they know that the way to do it is to raise the tuition to unaffordable levels. Then the government brings in the millions.
Now, let me try an argument to see how persuasive you find it, and that is the rising productivity of labor. So that a faculty, name the position, teacher in English, chemistry, physics, as technology has permitted American labor to become more and more and more and more productive, even though the English teacher is doing the same thing that he or she did today that he or she did 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 50 years ago. English is actually a good example here because it's relatively unchanging. You're teaching Shakespeare today as Shakespeare was taught a long time ago. Nevertheless, it's a matter of the marketplace. Institutions have to pay more to hire that labor, that professor, precisely because wage rates throughout the opportunity cost. If they're not an English teacher, they could go to work for Intel, presumably. So the rising wage rates in the economy drive up costs in the academy.
That's one theory. No. Another,
I thought it was pretty good.
One of the things that happens is that over time, more and more emphasis is put on research. And for example, when I started teaching back in the 1960s, the average teaching load was about 12 semester hours. Today, that's considered backbreaking work.
That was Cornell when you first?
No, it was Douglas College at Rutgers University, and that was common. Now today, it's 6 semester hours. You've got to hire twice as many professors to teach the same number of courses. And that may be carried on the books as a teaching expense. It's in fact a research expense, because the reason you have to do that is because you expect these guys to be grinding out these articles and books.
Okay. Last comment on question on academic costs. Senator Obama has proposed a $4,000 a year refundable tax credit, refundable tuition tax credit for every year of college. You like that idea?
Not particularly.
All right. On to.
I wouldn't be surprised if tuition didn't go up by $4,000.
The minute that was enacted. All right.
Or soon thereafter.
All right. Facts and fallacies concerning race. The black family, quote, some of them, quoting you again, some of the most basic beliefs and assumptions about the black family are demonstrably fallacious, including the assumption that current fatherless families so prevalent among contemporary blacks are, quote, a legacy of slavery, close quote. Explain that one.
Because the proportion of black kids who were raised in two-parent families was higher under slavery and for generations thereafter than today. That percentage was, go back to 1930 or 40, wasn't half the proportion of blacks being raised by single parents as there is today. Now, if slavery was the reason, why are these generations closer to slavery? And even under slavery itself, why were they raising their kids in two-parent families and they're not today?
Okay, now, well, let me try an argument on you. And the notion there is that what is a legacy of slavery is somewhat weaker, demonstrably weaker, of family bonds. So that, yes, the black family is more intact in past decades than it is today. So was the white family. And as we get these strange social solvents of the 1960s that seem to weaken family bonds, they weaken bonds among the white families, but they devastate family bonds among blacks, precisely because they're weaker in the first place, and that is the legacy of slavery. What do you make of that one?
Not much.
I'm trying hard here.
Well, I give you E for effort. It also depends on the level of income. That is, you're not going to be able to, someone who's in a position to go on to college, and has a very good chance of becoming an engineer or something of that sort. A girl like that is not likely to get pregnant and ruin it all, as well as someone who's had a bad time in school, who has very, very poor prospects in the job market, and going on welfare is not that big a sacrifice as compared to whatever the options happen to be. Right. Similarly with crime, by the way.
Right, crime. Well, crime, let me set this one up for you. Again, quoting from Economic Facts and Fallacies. Racial discrimination is frequently listed among the prime root causes of riots and other criminality among blacks, but crime among black Americans was declining for years prior to the decade of the 1960s with its landmark civil rights laws and its war on poverty programs. If crime is not arising from poverty, what's it arising from? What happens in the 1960s?
They stopped punishing criminals. The chance that a criminal would actually go to jail for a violent crime or any crime was much reduced in the 1960s. You begin to have all these changes in the law beginning at the Supreme Court, which becomes harder and harder to convict anybody of anything. And the sentences were shorter, and there were more, leniency in terms of parole and that kind of stuff. And of course, wherever you've done that in the world, including in Britain, for example, you see this huge increase. I mean, Britain was once one of the most law-abiding countries in the world. Today, Britain has a higher crime rate than the United States in most categories.
You quote former Senator Edward Brooke, an African-American who grew up in the black community in Washington, D.C. during the 1920s and 1930s. This is Edward Brooke. Large areas of Washington, D.C., talking about the black community, were truly safe. Families stayed together, neighbors helped one another, students were encouraged to study, and there were no drugs and no drive-by shootings. Was Edward Brooke's Washington of the 20s and 30s like Tom Sowell's Harlem of the late 40s, early 50s? Is that when you were moving?
It would be the 40s, from the early 40s.
All right, the 40s.
Middle, yes.
All right. But I've heard you talk about Harlem.
Yes. Yeah, I used to sleep out on a fire escape at Harlem. At midnight, if I was awake at midnight, I would go walking out to the nearest newsstand to get the morning paper to find out what the baseball scores were. I'm sure people don't do that today.
Harlem felt safe.
Yes.
And what about the schools?
The schools were a lot better. People expected me to meet the same standards that kids on Park Avenue met. Now that was undoubtedly unjust, but as between that injustice and spending the rest of your life paying back for a poor education to begin with, I'll go with that injustice.
All right. So what has happened in black America? Part of what's going on is that crime ceases to be punished. You've already mentioned that. What else is going on? Wait, let me put the question the other way around. What can be done, if anything, what can be done to restore to Harlem today, or to those same black neighborhoods? Much of the geography is still the same. What can be done to make those neighborhoods in Harlem the way they were for you growing up in the 40s, or the way they would for Edward Brooke in the 20s and 30s? How can black America be restored?
Mainly by fighting against all kinds of entrenched special interests who will not give up or budge an inch, starting with the teachers union. You need to be able to fire teachers who aren't teaching. You need to be able to have competing schools nowadays, because it'll take you forever to be able to fire the teachers, so that you'll give them an incentive to start teaching again instead of playing games in the schools. In the schools, as in the colleges, it is a lot easier not to teach. I mean, I'm always amazed at all the activities and projects they have in the schools, you know, all the while. And I'm looking at the international comparison. American students are way down at or near the bottom in these international tests. Why are we spending so much time, you know, hugging trees and doing other such stuff like that when our kids can't read?
So if you had to choose one point, one place to begin the restoration of Black America, it would be with education.
Yes.
All right. Tom, let me end with, we've been talking about economic facts and fallacies. Let me end with just a couple of open-ended questions to see what's on the mind of Tom Sowell these days. Over the last 5 years, the Bush administration has spent $18 billion on AIDS in Africa. And during President Bush's trip to Africa, which is concluding as you and I speak today, rock star and AIDS activist Bob Geldof praised Bush as having done more for Africa than any other American president. How does all that strike you?
I'd have to see what the consequences were. Nothing is easier than giving out money. You get very little resistance. The question is, what is the bottom line result? Has AIDS gone down as a result of all this?
Okay. Barack Obama has a serious chance, polls indicate at the moment, an actual likelihood of becoming the first African-American president. What does that say to you about the United States?
Well, it makes it harder for people to keep blaming everything on racism. On the other hand, I think at a time when Iran may get nuclear weapons, which may be passed on to terrorists, it is incredible that we should even be playing sort of demographic roulette and saying, wouldn't it be nice to have the first black president or the first woman president or whatever? We need whoever can do that job best because the future of the country depends on it.
Hmm. Interviewing you a couple of years ago, Fred Barnes asked if you felt pessimistic about the future. You responded very simply and with distressing speed, yes. Would you like to amend or expand upon that answer?
Yes, I feel more pessimistic now than I did then.
Oh, Tom. Why? What's happened in the last 2 or 3 years to make you more pessimistic about the future?
Well, we could start with Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain.
You've talked about Barack Obama. What's wrong with Hillary Clinton?
Oh, my. How many days do we have?
Take the top 2 or 3 characteristics.
An utterly cynical person. The whole thing, everything that happened during the Clinton administration, you can see that time and time again. McCain, he's better than they are, which is quite modest.
That's the stoutest praise you can raise.
That's the highest praise that I can manage.
All right, last question. You write, no book can cover all the utter nonsense that politicians speak in an election year, close quote. Would you care to name one piece of nonsense that you didn't get the chance to cover in Economic Facts and Fallacies that you consider especially dangerous or annoying?
The notion of that what we cannot afford in terms of medical care as 300 million Americans paying directly, we can somehow afford sending the same money through the government and paying for a government bureaucracy on top of all the other costs of medical care.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, thank you very much. For Uncommon Knowledge, I'm Peter Robinson at the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.